Well, thank you very much. I have the honor of speaking about a subject that actually has something resembling a happy ending today, and that is the thousands of Poles who survived World War II in Iran. Um, and first, I'd like to have a show of hands of just how many of you in the audience have actually heard about this topic. Okay, well, that's quite a few, so I'm happy to hear that. Um, there were, as far as numbers are concerned, there were about 120,000 Poles uh, that ended up in Iran starting in 1942, and that recovered there and lived to fight another day and eventually to make their way to the free world. Um, but the main question is, how did they end up there? How did they end up so far away from their native country in the Middle East? Well, during World War II, there is, and please forgive me, but unfortunately PowerPoint wasn't cooperating, so I'll have to go to YouTube to the source itself. And this is a World War II Allied American propaganda video about the Poles in Iran. So I will go ahead and let you draw your own conclusions. 1 second. Up.
Patriots from Poland nearing the end of one of the most amazing marches in history. 3,000 weary miles they crossed to find a haven of refuge. Some have babies that were born during a pathetic 3-year flight from their homeland. A people who since 1939
Pay attention here at this point.
as perhaps no other people have known it. A people who have known hunger, starvation, a people ground to helplessness beneath the heel of Nazi oppression. From one little town in Poland, 1,000 men, women, and children fled from the Nazis into Russia. When the Nazis followed, they pushed on, through mountain and desert, 3,000 miles to Persia, to a haven in Iran on the Caspian Sea. Here they found a promised land, a refugee city of their countrymen deep in the foothills of the Trans-Caucasian Mountains. From British and American Red Cross stations, they received fresh clothing, shoes to replace those worn ragged beyond recognition or repair. The first real home-cooked meal in years. Quickly, schools are formed that Poland's speech may never die. Mothers till the ancient soil of Persia, while father, son, and daughter leave to join new armies of the Polish government in exile. Legions of Polish women and legions of Polish men now forming to join the United Nations in the fight against the Axis. The prayers of their countrymen go with them, prayers for their success and prayers for their safe return. Daily, little Poland in Persia grows as new arrivals swell their numbers. Reunion in Iran for families parted more than 3 years ago. The courageous people of Poland, staunch allies of the United Nations in the fight for freedom.
Okay, so that is what Americans were fed during the Second World War by pro-Soviet propaganda. But of course, the reality was much different. These Poles were, perhaps they were fleeing the Nazis, but even more so, they were actually, they were also fleeing their international socialist ideological cousins to the east. So our story begins actually on August 22nd, 23rd, 1939, when Hitler and Stalin signed the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which partitioned Poland, drawing a line in the middle of Poland, partitioning the country amongst themselves, and whereby Stalin gave Hitler the green light to start the Second World War. So, of course, the Germans attacked on September 1st. The Soviets waited a little bit and attacked or stabbed Poland in the back on September 17th. Now, the Soviet occupation in eastern Poland lasted for almost 2 years. And its essential feature was terror. One part of that was, of course, the extermination, especially of the elites. One of the most infamous examples of this is the genocidal crime in Katyn Forest, which was perpetrated by the NKVD in April 1940, when about 23,000 Polish officers, policemen, and members of the elite of all faiths, not just Catholics, but also Protestants, the Orthodox, even Jews and Muslims, were executed. Those who were not executed in this way were basically shipped off to the east in several waves of deportations. And this was following up on the anti-Polish operation of the NKVD. This was basically a continuation of that in eastern Poland. So this was, in other words, this was an ethnic cleansing campaign. So about several hundred thousand Poles were shipped off to the east. The lowest estimates, which are about 320,000, the more higher estimates are about a million. The 320,000 estimate is based solely on Soviet archives, and there's a lot of evidence that it minimizes, underrates the amount of people that were shipped off. So there's a great chapter on that in Professor Chodakiewicz's book, The Intermarium. So I encourage you to read it, because there's a detailed discussion there of the fact that the low estimate consisted solely on counting the official number of people who could be herded into one of these famous Soviet cattle cars. Now, of course, many more people were herded into them than the Soviets admitted. So a million people would not be an unrealistic estimate at all. Now, where were these Poles shipped? Well, they were basically strewn about all over the territory of the Soviet Union in the hellish Gulag archipelago. And the red dots that you see here are the camps that make up the Soviet concentration camp system at this time. Now, things changed on June 22nd, 1941, when the two allies, the Nazis and the Soviets, when the Nazi allies of the Soviets invaded the Soviet Union, and the Soviet regime was, at least in the first months, fighting for its future. So under the pressure of the British and also the Polish government exile, they were compelled to reluctantly free some of the Polish POWs and the Gulag survivors. Now, and these Poles were to be formed into basically a Polish army, a Polish armed force to fight against the Germans. The Soviets released General Władysław Anders to head this force. Of course, he had been held in Łubianka prison, the notorious NKVD prison in Moscow, where he had also been tortured. So he had no love for the Soviets at all. And when the Soviets refused to provide the Poles with adequate supplies and weapons, and also planned to basically disperse them along the front, as opposed to forming a cohesive Polish force, the Poles decided it would be better to get out of the Soviet Union as fast as possible and get as many Poles out of there. as possible. So here we have, this was basically the route taken by the Polish forces out of the Soviet Union from the southern Ural area, the area around Buzuluk and Saratov, through Kazakhstan and Central Asia, and then westward into the Soviet republics bordering on Iran. And of course, this force was gathering as many Poles, including women and children, as possible. Eventually, it grew into about this large group of Poles grew into 120,000 strong contingent, and among them were about 40,000 women and children. Now, first, the Poles had to cross the Caspian, and here is on these Soviet ships such as the Zhdanov. And all of these ships were overloaded since the Poles were willing to risk their lives to get out of the Soviet Union. So here is the Zhdanov. The Zhdanov left the port city of Krasnovodsk in what is now Turkmenistan on the Caspian Sea for the Persian port of Pahlavi, which is also called Anzali. And many Poles actually didn't survive this journey. Many of them were close to starvation. So here is actually the condition of the Poles, especially the children and the teenagers. The child on the left was one of the evacuees in 1942. As you see, there is really no difference between the condition of that child and some of the children who barely survived the Holocaust. The teenagers were in a slightly better condition, as you see them to the right, but nevertheless, they were very emaciated, and so many of these people, had they stayed in the Soviet Union for several more weeks or months, would have most likely ended up dying there. So the evacuation to Iran saved the lives of thousands and tens of thousands of Poles. Now, most of the Poles landed in Anzali or Pahlavi, which is the port that you see on the Caspian Sea right here, and eventually, after they recovered and recuperated, made their way into Iraq, which was then a British protectorate, and then into Transjordan, Palestine. This was the men basically were a Polish armed force, and they eventually lived to fight the Germans in North Africa and even in Italy. So a lot of these survivors of the Soviet Gulag who passed to Iran eventually captured Monte Cassino in 1944 in Italy. And also the children, especially contingent consisting of children, left the Soviet Union from Ashgabat, which is the capital of Turkmenistan, then which was a Soviet republic, through the eastern Iranian city of Mashhad, which unfortunately I don't think is on the map, but it's somewhere around here. And the Poles were basically spread out throughout Iran, but especially in the largest cities. So Tehran, Kazvin, Esfahan, even Ahvaz. I'm not going to actually show it on the map, but now this is the condition of the children after they managed to regain their health and their spirit in Iran. So obviously they're looking a lot better, a lot healthier, and some of them are smiling, obviously, but many of them are still obviously scarred by their experiences in the Soviet Union. A lot of the Polish children were housed and survived in the city of Esfahan. It's an ancient city in central Iran, and it's one of the most ancient cities in Iran. Actually, its history goes back way into the pre-Islamic days, and This is one of the most famous landmarks in Esfahan. It's a 16th century mosque complex built by the Safavid dynasty. And as an aside, if you'll notice, this mosque complex represents the typical Persian sacred architecture in Iran and Central Asia and Afghanistan. And you will notice the large domes and the arches called iwans. Well, this was basically a modification of pre-Islamic architecture, Sasanian architecture, which was the basic Sasanian fire temple. Zoroastrian fire temple consisted of an arch and a dome. Of course, this was a modification, but the dome was larger, and the arch was instead of forming a shape like this, it was sharper. So here we have a postage stamp commemorating the Polish children who survived and were sheltered in Esfahan. A lot of them actually lived and dwelled in the Armenian section of Esfahan, which was named Jolfa. And on the right, you have the Vank Cathedral, which is the Armenian cathedral in Esfahan in the Jolfa district. A fun story was Wojtek, the soldier bear. So soldiers of the 22nd Polish Artillery Supply Company, as they were moving through the city of Hamadan, purchased this Persian black bear and made this bear famous. We have to remember that during this time, Iran was occupied by both the Soviets and the British. The invasion took place in August 1941. Mostly the Soviets occupied the northern parts of Iran, while the British focused on the southern parts, and especially the oil-rich regions in Khuzestan and the southwest. During this time, the occupiers replaced Reza Shah, who was a nationalist, and he was ousted by them mostly because they saw him as a pro-German leader, which of course he did have pro-German sympathies. I don't believe he would have actually joined the war on the side of the Germans, but since the Iranians had a long history and not a very pleasant history with both the Russians and the British, who had designs on their territory. So I think it's not surprising that the Iranians would have some sympathies for the enemies of their enemies. And Reza Shah's son, Mohammad Reza Shah, was then placed on the throne, and he even declared, in 1943, he actually even declared war on Nazi Germany, and also Iran during this time hosted the Tehran conference, which for the Poles, unfortunately, was not a very positive event, because it basically sealed the Soviet sphere of influence in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, during this occupation, the Soviets and the British cooperated on many fronts. Here you see on the right side Indian soldiers fighting on the side of the British, because obviously India was a colony of the British Empire at this time, and on the left side you see the Soviet soldiers. And here's the Red Army passing through the city of Tabriz in northwestern Iran. And of course, the Soviets did not actually, once they stepped into Iran, they did not want to leave. In fact, they did what they could to establish separatist Soviet republics. So an Azerbaijani Soviet Republic and a Kurdish Soviet Republic. And the only thing that finally compelled the Soviets to leave, to go home, was pressure by the United States and President Truman in 1946. Now, parenthetically, I think that incident shows that had the Americans, had the Truman administration really cared about Central and Eastern Europe, they might have applied the same pressure during this time, and perhaps the Soviets would have evacuated at least a part of Central and Eastern Europe. We don't know, but the example of the Soviets finally leaving Iran in 1946 would suggest that it was a possibility. Not surprisingly, Iranians were both bewildered and angry about the occupation of their country at this time. And one thing to remember about Iranians is that they have a very strong national identity, and that they certainly do not like foreigners dictating to them or telling them what to do, or especially occupying their country. And no one does, but the Persians in particular, since after all, they once had an empire which for several centuries was one of the superpowers of the ancient world. During its peak, under the Achaemenid dynasty, it stretched all the way from borders of India and Central Asia, all the way to Greece and what is now Eastern Libya and Egypt. And the Iranians still remember this. But to argue that the occupation was what compelled or convinced the Iranians to shelter the Poles would be, I think, an exaggeration at best and a falsehood, because there is another aspect of Persian culture that we have to focus on, which is traditional Persian hospitality. The notion that a guest is basically someone sacred, someone that we cannot turn away. So if you ever visit an Iranian household, they will do their utmost to make sure that your stay is that you feel welcome, and they'll serve you, and they'll keep bringing you food, and even in some cases, even if it ends up bankrupting them. Now, here are two quotes from Polish Gulag survivors who spent time in Iran, who escaped the Soviet Union through Iran, about Persian hospitality. One of them was a young Polish girl at the time who said, "We were a group of hapless and weak human beings who found themselves on the edge of death due to hunger, malnutrition, and disease. When we reached Bandar Anzali, Pahlavi, locals gathered around us and brought food, clothes, shoes, and even sweets and fruits, and they smiled at us. The Iranians accepted us as we were. They saw that we needed help, and they offered their help." Dr. Filipovich, who ended up being a physician in the city of Caspian in northwestern Iran, said, "Iranians line up every day in front of the Polish refugee camp, bringing food, clothing, and other essential articles. And this was at a time when, due to the wartime economic difficulties, they were compelled to combat numerous economic problems and food shortages." So here we are talking about common, ordinary Iranians volunteering food and anything that they could find to the Poles without any compulsion by the government or by the Allied authorities. Now, those Poles who perished were buried in Iranian soil. There is one very nice cemetery in Tehran, and there's another one in Pahlavi/Anzali. This is here, in this image, we have the cemetery in Tehran. Now, 60 years later, or after 1979, and especially after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, the Islamic Republic has tried to capitalize on the goodwill that this episode created in Poland. So we have ambassadors of the Islamic Republic who constantly dwell on the subject of how Iran saved tens of thousands of Polish Gulag survivors during World War II. And they aren't lying. The only point is that the regime that saved these Poles was the regime of the evil Shah, whom they overthrew in 1979. And ironically, the current Islamist regime in Tehran is an ally of post-Soviet Russia. So you have the Ayatollahs shaking hands with the children and grandchildren of the NKVD. And this leads us to the main lesson that we can glean from this event, which is that we should not conflate the regime in Iran and the people in Iran. And I think that this is, if Reagan lived, this is probably what he would have advised us to remember.